Thank you, Betsy. That was very kind. I really appreciate that. And I want to thank the Society for International Development for the invitation to speak here today. I think it's fair to say this may be one of the larger gatherings in the United States that'll pay close attention to what the high-level panel had to say. So it's a pleasure to be invited, a pleasure to be with you, and I thank you for coming out so early in the morning. I know this is an audience with a great number of questions and probably some very specific questions about the UN high-level panel report on the post-2015 development agenda that we handed to the Secretary General last week. So I want to lay out some of the core ideas undergirding the report and then have some time for questions, which Dan Runde will lead us in. I also want to thank the development community as a whole, of which SID has always been such an important part. The work of our panel has been a journey, but fortunately, I think we've had some very able assistance along the way. In my case, Gail Smith at the National Security Council staff chaired an interagency committee to support our work. We had more than 20 meetings. And knowing the history of the MDGs, it was very encouraging sign that the United States government was committed to the post-2015 agenda from the very beginning, rather than waiting many years to decide whether to embrace it. As the president made crystal clear, I think, in the State of the Union this year when he called for an end to extreme poverty. I also just want to give a shout out to John Norris, Casey Dunning, and Christina Costa, who are my support at CAP, and they've done a fabulous job. But I also want to give a collective thanks to the wisdom, expertise, knowledge, and passion of the incredibly diverse array of people the high-level panel met with throughout the process. We consulted with the poorest of the poor, the disenfranchised, and the disabled. We met with coalitions of operational experts in health, nutrition, education, the environment, gender, and trust me on this, in more sectors than I can reasonably list here this morning. We heard voices from the private sector and from philanthropy. We met with incredible and thoughtful and well-organized young people and children. We did that face-to-face. We did it over social media. It's not an exaggeration, I think, to say that 27 panel members and their advisors benefited from literally thousands of consultations, including formal efforts by the UN system to survey people across the globe regarding their aspirations for the post-2015 agenda. So I think when you're willing to listen, you can learn a great deal. I think my fellow panel members and I internalized a lot of knowledge about what worked and what didn't work with the original MDGs and what we needed to maintain and what we needed to improve. We also took powerful lessons from the consultations held with individuals around the world, particularly the poor themselves. They argued convincingly that a bold, ambitious, and integrated development agenda that seeks not only to address the symptoms of extreme poverty, but to create the institutions, the systems, and the practices that will make poverty eradication irreversible. So what worked about the original MDGs? To focus on just a few points. First, the goals and targets were clear, were well communicated, compelling, and blessedly jargon-free. If you go back and read the Millennium Declaration itself today, I think you'll marvel at that all the member states agreed to such a forward-looking vision. The MDGs then followed, and they were concise and data-driven. This meant we were able to continually measure our progress. The MDGs helped drive planning at the global, national, and local level to agree, I think, that surprised most. Obviously, we've got some years to go and we've got some work to do, but I think they made an important impact. In some areas, the MDGs, I think it's fair to say, work less well. Progress towards the MDGs was uneven across and within countries. In too many places, people were excluded by the dint of their ethnicity, caste, geographic location, gender, or other factors. The original MDGs were also designed solely to deal with poor countries through a kind of traditional north-south lens. The MDGs were silent on key factors that play a powerful role in determining if development is successful. Issues like creating accountable institutions, the pursuit of peace, the role of the private sector in building strong and inclusive economies. And finally, and perhaps most critically, the MDGs were too often implemented in what I would call silos. with each goal seen as a distinct and separate from the rest. That meant that addressing poverty and addressing our core environmental challenges were too often seen as two completely different conversations. So we learned some things from the experience of the MDGs, the way the world has changed, and the way the face of poverty has changed since 2000 and 2001. We now know that sustainable economic growth requires more than just increasing GDP. It requires shaping enduring and accountable systems and institutions that respect the rights of individuals and give them the tools they need to help lift themselves out of extreme poverty. It requires developing sustainable systems of production and consumption to manage our natural resources and safeguard our ecosystems. We now know that we must be deliberate in reaching historically marginalized populations, as I mentioned. We now know we must react to global climate change with urgency and purpose, working to cut greenhouse gas emissions while also helping countries build resilience to climate and extreme weather shocks and environmental degradation. The high-level panel, I think it's fair to say, took this experience to heart. In our recommendations, key parts of the original MDGs were kept and expanded, including efforts to end preventable child mortality, to curb maternal mortality, and to end hunger. But our report captures and endorses a number of new elements and themes that are beyond the scope of the original MDGs. These new issues were far from decided when the panel began its work when we were appointed last July and first met in New York in September. And I think that our willingness to take on these new areas without abandoning the core of the Millennium Development Goals is probably the prime reason that the report has received pretty warm welcome since its release. The report is grounded first and foremost in a pledge to leave no one behind by irreversibly ending extreme poverty by 2030, with no one on the planet living on less than $1.25 a day. The report still takes a cue from the MDGs by including specific, measurable targets that may sometimes seem pedestrian to Americans. These targets include things like increasing the security of land tenure, promoting government budget transparency, and ensuring that everyone has a valid and recognized legal identity. It was controversial at the beginning about whether even to include in this report a set of illustrative goals for the post-2015 agenda. But I think everyone on the panel came to the conclusion that without the strength of those illustrative goals, people couldn't imagine how the vision linked to measurable and achievable end states. Some of these are easily defined goals that seek to help the poorest of the poor or overcome the very real obstacles that keep them in poverty, being unable to inherit property because you're a woman, for instance, or being ineligible to benefit from government programs, or even to get employment in the formal sector because you were never given a birth certificate or a legal identity paper. But unlike in the more siloed Millennium Agenda, these individual targets were conceived as mutually reinforcing parts of a larger whole. The high-level panel's report knits together the poverty, social inclusion, and environmental agendas to offer in what, in my view, is a coherent vision of sustainable development. The panel recognized that any short-term gains in poverty reduction will ultimately be reversed if we don't address the environment and our actions within it. This led us to endorse targets that seek to make global patterns of consumption and production more sustainable and that encourages responsible use of our natural resources. These targets ran the gamut from reducing food waste to increasing environmental sustainability in government procurement practices, from seeking zero net deforestation to reducing the rate of freshwater withdrawals. The panel was also in firm agreement that these two narratives, the poverty and the sustainability agendas, require that there be one set of post-2015 goals and targets and that they apply universally. The world has moved well beyond the North-South dichotomy that defined the original MDGs. The panel sought to put forth a report and illustrative goals in which every country could play a role, realizing that while recognizing our different capacities and responsibilities, we all have work to do at home as well as contributions to make abroad. It's my belief that not only can the United States play an important role in eradicating extreme poverty abroad, but that we can do things that are good for our own economy and environment, like ending fossil fuel subsidies, dramatically reducing food and agricultural waste. When we look at problems like child mortality, literacy rates, access to reproductive, sexual health care and rights, we need to do a better job at home, quite frankly, while simultaneously helping drive progress abroad. These lessons, the need to be deliberate about ensuring that aid reaches the poorest and most marginalized people, the need to explicitly wed the poverty and sustainability agendas into one coherent framework, the need to move past the North-South dichotomy and toward a truly universal development agenda. These lessons are taken straight from the experience of the MDGs. But the most important lesson, I think, is that while the MDGs have shown us how a global agenda can galvanize investment, energize civil society, and drive measurable change, they also have shown that a stovepipe agenda will never fully succeed. Further, I think they showed us that the organizations that make up the development community, people you represent in this room, need to work together within each issue area and to form relationships across these issue areas. You might be thinking that's probably easier said than done, and you'd probably be right. But if you're devoted to child nutrition issues, to preventing stunning and malnutrition, then it follows that you should be concerned with fostering sustainable agricultural practices and creating the right kind of social safety nets in societies, in addition to ensuring that children have enough to eat. If you care about preventing maternal and infant deaths, you got to concern yourself with sexual and reproductive health care and rights and ensuring that girls and young women receive educations in addition to working with programs to provide prenatal care and skilled birth attendants. These are the lessons that not only came out of the experience of the MDGs, but from the experience and voices of the many thousands of poor people, women, young people, people with disabilities who we met with throughout the high-level panel process. The lives of the poor are not stovepiped. They see clearly how one set of challenges can beget another and another. They see clearly how hunger and illness make it harder for children to attend school, how a lack of education curtails employment for a lifetime. We need to adjust our approach to development to reflect lived experiences of the poor. The high-level panel's report attempts to move in that direction. The panel recognized that poverty will not be eradicated and sustainable development will not be achieved without the concerted efforts of government, of civil society, of the private sector, of multilateral organizations, and academia. That's why the report calls, and I think this is one of the most important findings, if you will, ideas embedded in the report, but the report calls for a new and wide-ranging global partnership for development that spans these groups and brings marginalized and vulnerable populations, especially women and young people, to the table. The voices of women and young people and other marginalized groups will be as essential to implementing and realizing the post-2015 agenda at the international, at the national, at the local level, as they have been so far in informing the priorities that are put forward by our group and many others who are contributing to the process, the intergovernmental process at the UN. One of the things I think I'm most proud of in the panel's report is the renewed commitment to empower girls and women and achieve gender equality. The panel tackled head-on the discrimination and marginalization that women around the world are subjected to daily. Chief amongst our proposals are targets to eliminate violence against girls and women and to end child marriage. Throughout the panel's work over the last year, I've been inspired by the many voices that have contributed to the process, as I've said this morning. But I have to say that none has been more positive than about what the world in 2030 could look like than the young people that we've talked to. These are the people who stand to benefit most from the successful implementation of a sustainable development agenda, and so brought unparalleled passion and vigor to the high-level panel process. I spoke at an event earlier this week with Ambassador Elizabeth Cousins, part of the U.S. government team in New York, working on issues at the United Nations. He's the deputy ambassador to UN. I guess she's going to get a new boss here soon. But Elizabeth leads the effort at the Open Working Group, the other parallel process on the SDGs that came out of Rio. She said very clearly that she has never before seen such intense public and civil society interest as she has witnessed with this post-2015 agenda. I think that really speaks to an understanding by many people, particularly young people, that they need to be involved, that they should be involved in setting the agenda that will directly affect their lives. I think we can hear the voices of youth throughout this report, but I think it is strongest in the specific target to reduce youth unemployment. This was the #1 concern of young people in both developed and developing countries that we heard from. The panel heard these concerns and responded to them. The youth agenda is another place where I think the poise stands that the goals and targets in the post-2015 agenda must be integrated and mutually reinforcing. Youth unemployment is a global crisis. Getting young people into productive employment will continue to be a challenge in the years to come. Fully 40% of the global population today is under 24 years of age, and in some countries, more than half the population is under 15. Today's children and youth are 2030's labor force, but in the United States and elsewhere, less educated young people have a harder time finding employment than those who stay in school, so targeting youth unemployment means targeting education. It means the innovation, diffusion, and adoption of new technologies to transform our energy, water, and agricultural sectors that will in turn create new enterprises and new employment opportunities. It means teaching entrepreneurship and ensuring that enterprising young adults have access to credit and can get business licenses without needing to pay bribes to local officials. The report, I think, makes an unprecedented push for effective public institutions that are responsive to the needs of their citizens and that encourage peace and stability. Given the array of voices on the high-level panel, including these governance targets, was no easy feat. I want to emphasize again how essential the voices and input of the poor and marginalized around the world were to formulating these particular recommendations. In consultations the world over, people called for effective government that is transparent and can be held to account, for institutions that respond to their needs, and for outlets to meaningful participation in the lives of their country. With more than 40% of the world's poorest living in conflict and fragile, conflict-affected and fragile states, it's clear that none of the global anti-poverty targets will be met in 2030 if we don't do a better job helping states transition out of war. The report targets a specific drop in violent deaths by 2030 while calling for measurable progress in access to effective justice institutions that undergird peaceful societies. The report also spells out targets for transparency and efforts to tackle corruption. Many of these issues are subject to fierce debate, will be subject to fierce debate as U.S. member states try to finalize an agreement on the post-2015 agenda in the next couple of years. There are clearly some states that would prefer that the issues of governance and peace be omitted from the global goal-setting exercise, but including these goals, I think, in the high-level panel report reflected the very passionate opinions expressed by global civil society during the course of our work. The poorest of the poor know that sound, transparent institutions and the absence of conflict are absolutely central to the aspirations for healthier, better educated, more prosperous futures. Member states who ignore that wisdom imperil the success of the 2015 agenda. I want to reiterate a point that many of you will have heard me make. The panel's report is the first chapter and not the final word in the effort to create a meaningful post-2015 agenda. We hope only that the report is a useful tool in the conversation and debate that is to come, and that the optimism and ambition of the high-level panel carries throughout to the final agenda. I want to close with a personal observation. The report, I believe, is ambitious and bold in part because that was our mandate. That's what the Secretary General charged us with doing. But I think the report's overall level of ambition, its narrative coherence, and its warm reception to date are the result of the personal relationships formed between the panel members, advisors, and the UN Secretariat over the course of 9 months. We came to the panel from very different countries, very different experiences, but I think there was a genuine sense of trust in the room, even when we disagreed, and a shared desire to see the multilateral system pull together to face some of the more serious challenges. I think that's at issue today as we see failure to some extent in areas around trade and the slow pace of change in the global climate conversation. But I think that that trust can be built, and while there'll be great many twists and turns before the post-2015 agenda is agreed to in New York, and there will be moments where it looks like things are going backward rather than forward. That is a natural process, I think, in anything like this. But I think if we all keep in mind an appreciation for the transformative power of a shared vision, we'll have already made the first and most important step in ending extreme poverty. So I hope that gives you a sense of both our process and our results, and I'd be happy to take some of your questions. Dan?
Thanks a lot, John. I have read the high-level panel report. I want to congratulate you. I think it's very interesting. I thought the fact that you added a whole section on governance, I thought was a huge success. I know that this bubbled up from the global south, if you will, and I know there were other folks that were also supporters of that, but I think it was very important. I thought the new edition of the discussion on livelihoods, I think, was excellent. I thought that the reflection on the changed world from 15 years ago in terms of technology and data, the emphasis of entrepreneurship on I have one hobby horse, which is this issue of business startups and the relationships to the number of steps it takes to start a business, and the doing business metrics in particular. I've done a lot of work in my day job on this, and so I think to the extent that the World Bank doesn't mess with the doing business metrics would be a good thing and is in line with the MDGs and the high-level panel report. So I'll make that one plug. So as the president of the World Bank reviews his panel report on the doing business metrics, I do hope that he keeps the high-level panel's report in mind and the remarks and analysis that you made in that report. So there are a lot of smart people in the room. There is a big bright light on me, but I did see several people in the room I want to call on. I know we have microphones as well throughout, and so I think we want to get a lot of questions and John's been generous with his time, and we've got about 25 minutes to take questions. So I'd like to do this World Bank style, where we kind of bunch 2 or 3 questions at a time, and if people agree to keep their questions short and not use this as a soapbox moment, I think that will be even better. I know there's some folks here with microphones, right? I'm trying to see. There's one back there. So I'm gonna ask for a show of hands for questions, and if not, I'm gonna call on a couple people to get this started. I'm thinking about a couple people in the front row, but let me first have Jeff Grieco. If someone could come here up quickly to the front row, my friend Jeff Grieco, who is with IRD, which is a development organization, nonprofit, but also Jeff served in the Bush administration with me at USAID. Jeff?
Thank you very much for your comments this morning. I'd like to find out from you, how much debate was there internally in the high-level panel on the issue of the greatest contributor to poverty reduction and sustainability being economic growth and the growth agenda? Both the IMF and the bank have come out very strongly that they believed, and there's some UN committees supporting this too, that for the next round of MDGs, there needs to be a more integral discussion about both the macro and the microeconomic growth contributors to poverty reduction, and trying to get more impetus into the MDGs that might actually help push trade round negotiations and a series of other openings at the developing country level.
I'm looking at a couple of my friends in the front row, and I want to just signal to them. I'm going to probably call on them. Larry Cooley, I'm going to call on you. Nora Reyes, I'm going to call on you. And Ambassador Jim Michael, I see you back there, the former head of the DAC. I'm going to call on you at some point. So, but John, why don't you answer that question? Okay. I'm going to give those 3 folks a chance to think.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very critical question, as I tried to outline in my comments. I think it's growth plus. I think that growth absolutely is a necessary condition, and having the enabling conditions, including the ability for a more development-friendly trading system in the world, is absolutely critical. But I think if you don't also target how one connects the modern economy to the very poorest people, if you don't provide them with access to energy, with access to finance, with access to, obviously, to education, with access to a healthcare system that's going to, provide a basic level of health, then you can leave, literally 1 billion people behind, even as you put in place the building blocks that can maintain stronger private sector growth overall. We were benefited from having really, I think, a couple of visionary business leaders on our panel. Paul Pullman, who's the head of Unilever, and Betty Maina from Kenya, who's the head, a mid-sized enterprise business owner herself and the head of a SME enterprise in Kenya, who I think gave very strong voice to the need to create the right enabling environment, both nationally and globally, to move forward poverty alleviation, because so much of the flow of financing is not coming from ODA any longer. It's coming from private sector investment and from remittances from people who have emigrated to other countries. And the need to develop, to need to think about this kind of coherently and cohesively, but to put in place things like infrastructure that will benefit people in rural and urban areas is going to be quite critical. And I think the report does a good job of trying to lift that up as an important element of the development agenda.
Larry Cooley is the CEO of MSI and is also a board member of the SID International and also a former board member of SID Washington. Larry.
Hello?
Yep.
No,
It's hugely gratifying that people like you are choosing to care about issues like this, so thanks a lot for that. I have a couple of questions, but they're really the same question in two different ways, which have to do with asking you, if you would, to let us inside the tent of the conversations a little bit. The first one has to do with remembering the role that you played for such a long time as a representative and a senior person in this government, and knowing how resistant some governments are to anything they see as coming from outside their own borders. If you walked away from this with any sense as to how those of us who care about these issues can make them most palatable to the governments that are going to have to not only adopt them but implement them. And since I think ours has shown itself to be fairly resistant to these kinds of things at different points in time, we're probably a good case in point on that issue. And the second, more specifically on the issues of governance, you made a point, and I think it's wonderful that the group managed to reach a consensus and incorporate issues on that, but I wonder if you could let us inside that conversation a little bit in terms of both where the points of resistance were and what you think it means in terms of trying to roll that out operationally.
You want
No, yeah, actually, why don't we ask Nora as well, if you would. Nora is the vice president of SID International, had a long and illustrious career at the Inter-American Development Bank. Nora.
Thanks. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask if they were considered or how they were considered in your work. One has to do with education and the need to expand education and to make it flexible to allow people to blend and to take advantage of the opportunities happening in the market with such speed, which is asking you if anything in that report considers goals for distance education. That's one question. The second question has to do with women. And I was wondering if in the report somehow there was a discussion of how you change the definition of what is economy of care and who's responsible for it. Because culturally, in all countries of the world, women are responsible for it. And in certain cases, it means holding them back to be able to work outside the home and therefore have economic autonomy. And it's been something which is very, very difficult to budge. So I wondered if you looked at that in the report.
Why don't we also call in Jim Michael. Ambassador Jim Michael was the head of the Development Assistance Committee, also was ambassador to Guatemala for the United States. Jim also had a long career both at the State Department and AID. So the Development Assistance Committee, as you all know, is the Major League Baseball Commission for official donors. So, Jim, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity, first of all, to offer two small comments. I think this inclusion of good governance and effective institutions is really a tremendous step forward in the way it is done, in which it puts an emphasis on the empowerment of people and their rights and holding people accountable in government and having access to information is just the right way to go about that. And second, I wanted to commend the panel's not trying to treat everybody as being on the same track and the same pace, but the differentiation among countries, I think is really a very valuable contribution. The question I have is, and I wonder, Mr. Podesta, if you could comment on the tension between aspirations of leaving no one behind and the practicalities of achieving numerical goals. And I see that you've done this in a very intelligent way, but it seems to me this is going to be a controversy and a challenge in the time ahead in trying to arrive at some final goals. And I'd appreciate what was the thinking of the panel about that tension. Thank you.
I'll start with the front end and talk about our government and how do you approach it, and then how do you kind of sell this globally. I think, look, my own experience is that, and I said it at the outset, the fact that there was leadership at the White House level to support this effort was really critical. Because generally, I think what's happened, or at least it's been my experience, particularly in this last year, that you can come up with lots of red lines and never come up with any green lines. You can come up with lots of things to say no to and never think how you want to move forward an agenda that you're really committed to. And so I think having a table at the White House that was really, I think, important to doing that. I also played a kind of an interesting and different sort of role. I was appointed not as a government representative. I guess, if you will, I was a representative of civil society, the person who headed a think tank. Now, I think most of the other panelists understood that I had some relationship to our government and to the Secretary of State when I was appointed, and to the President of the United States, and knew that I had influence with the government. But it gave me again, in our first meeting, the Secretary General asked us all to take our official hats off, give him our best judgment as to what the post-2015 agenda narrative should look like. That's a lot easier for me to do as a person who's in a ambiguous role, I suppose, than it is for someone who's the foreign affairs minister of Mexico or Colombia or South Korea, as we had on our panel, or our three co-chairs, David Cameron, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and President Yudhoyono of Indonesia. I mean, obviously, they powerfully represent their governments. But I think that that meant that, particularly on some issues like governance, and Dan kind of referred to this, it really was important to have not this be perceived as, particularly the North lecturing the South on governance issues. But
So leading from behind, John.
I would say that's, I'd say just being diplomatic. But, we had these very powerful voices who argued the finance minister of Nigeria, the president of Liberia, the development minister of Benin, who were arguing strongly for these inputs into the system. And that, I think, really was critical for that coming together. I think there's a question, though, around there's a implicit issue of whether where is it going to get tough now that this is going to be a intergovernmental process going forward. It already is one. The open working group process is an intergovernmental process, and then that will lead to ultimately a negotiation in 2015 about the post-2015 development process. And I think that these questions, particularly around peace and security, it goes to the last question, and I'm double back around on women in education, but it goes to national governments holding on to their sovereignty, not wanting the international system to interfere in their internal affairs. And I think particularly in the peace and security arena that there's a strong resistance at the front end to that concept. But I think we know so much about what the lack of peace and conflict does to really undermine any possibility of ending extreme poverty. That there's a very strong case to be made with respect to that. And I think that, again, the gentleman at the end commented on about the way we approach this, which is to provide a basic level of governmental support, assistance, connectivity, and access. It's to a government that's going to provide service and not engage in predatory behavior. And I think that's something that can be adopted at the global level. We had on the peace and security agenda, again, we had people like the finance minister from Timor-Leste, who's been, along with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the leader of the G7 Plus group, who really have kind of thought deeply about these questions. So we had really, I think, great representatives on the panel who could make the argument in a way that it didn't sound like, David Cameron or some guy who used to work for Bill Clinton was wagging their finger at people, but who had the experience of trying to rebuild their own societies. On the question of distance education, I think that our calls to try to universalize some of these goals really, I think, implicate both the need to kind of shift and innovate in providing reasonable education or quality education to young people, and also to try to reach into pockets already right now in conflict-affected places. The solution space there, I think, is ripe for distance education, but we don't have in our illustrative targets, we don't have a specific target on that topic. You asked about the economy of care and women responsibility. I couldn't agree with you more, but I think maybe the way we tackle that and the way that we'll move forward with that is to give voice to women in all the processes of politics, of the economy, in education, and try to, if you have, I think, whether that's in providing quality education or ensuring that they have access to rights like inheritance, etc., the more women are at the table, the more this problem is going to get taken care of. I have no doubt about that at all. I do think we focus on enhancing the quality of human capital as key, comes back to the earlier point, the key to economic growth and to economic development. And you can't do that if you're leaving half of your human potential behind. So I think these things do work together, and I'm hopeful that as we move forward globally, they will make a difference there. On the question of practicality, we debated that a lot, and you'll see some of the goals are universal, some of them are zero-targeted goals, because we thought the aspiration of those zero targets was critical, and that if the world put its mind to it, it could achieve, an end to preventable death by some metric that could be agreed to at the global level. Many of the targets in our illustrative target list, which is contained in the annex, don't take that perspective, because we know that you can only make progress to some extent. But we had again, I'm mentioning a number of the panelists because they were so important. The person that runs the Poverty Lab at MIT, who you probably know, Dan, Abhijit Banerjee, pounded on this question, and John's smiling, in every single meeting we were in, which is that getting to zero, you couldn't promise getting to zero if you couldn't produce getting to zero. And so I think he kept us focused on these questions of practicality, and the World Bank has adopted a 3% goal. But I think that we were called on, I think, to make a judgment about ambition and vision and compare that to the practicality. And I think where we adopted a zero-based goal, I think we thought we could get there, and we thought the world should be charged, and all the actors, as I mentioned, in this global partnership should be held accountable to trying to reach that set of zero goals.
Okay, I see several hands, but I also want to signal to a couple people that I'm going to also call. I want to call on Mirza, and I want Connie, if Connie Villette is still here, I want to call on you in a little bit too, as I see, come back and get coffee and come back. But, so let's see, we've got my friend Elaine Grigsby, who was at USAID. Then we also have my good friend Kent Hill, who is the Senior Vice President at World Vision. And then we've got Steve Mosley, who's a former president of SID Washington and with UN USA. And then we're going to have from Mirza Jahani. So why don't we start first with Elaine, please?
I'm happy to start, but a small correction.
Yeah.
Carol Grigsby, not Elaine.
Yeah, Carol,
I know
sorry.
Elaine
I
well.
always confuse
I know
between Elaine.
well,
Sorry,
and
Carol.
We are both
Thank you,
former
Carol.
USAID, so no problem. Anyway, Carol Grigsby. I am formerly with USAID now, Grigsby Global Consulting, and I serve with Paul Pullman on the advisory board for Perkins International, which works on disability issues. And in that context, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the Leave No One Behind goal, which I obviously applaud in this context, and to know a little more about the discussions that you had with disability groups and what sort of advice they gave you on leaving no one behind, and what sorts of discussions you had within the panel about the ways to actually reach out in both an access sense and in an actual participation sense for people with disabilities in education and the job market. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Microphone here for Kent Hill. Kent is on the SID Washington board as well as being leader at World Vision.
John, thanks for being here. Thanks for your comments and for the work you've done for the UN and all of us on thinking what's going to happen after 2015. All of this brings up the very delicate question about how one sets goals and how high one sets them, because we're often caught between the horns of a dilemma here. If we set them so high that it appears that we fail, then those who are suspicious of foreign assistance have some ammunition. On the other hand, we want to appropriately talk about the need. And when you look at the progress on the first goals, there's obviously some places we didn't achieve all we wanted to achieve. And yet, when we announce the new goals, it would appear that this is also a moment to say something about what was achieved. And when I think about under 5 mortality, for example, over the last couple of decades, and the fact that we've had that, I mean, it's a spectacular success. There are things that have happened that one cannot conceive of happening had not the global community cooperate. So my question is, do you think as we launch the new set of goals, there will be an appropriate celebratory time as well to talk about what has been achieved?
Steve Mosley. Microphone, please, to Steve Mosley.
Mr. Podesta, thank you very much. I think it's a remarkable report. I did actually have a chance to read it over the weekend, and one of the most remarkable things is it brings together and integrates so well, thoughtfully, a large platform around which even this community has often had internal debate and difficulty getting behind reports that speak about our future. But you seem to have achieved that, and the platform seems to provide a very inclusive basis on which we can get together. Yet at the same time, it depends on us getting together to be able to advocate for this in the future. So one of the questions, it's a two-part question. How do you see the civil society organizations within the development community being able to get behind this and play a role going forward to make sure that this has the chance of succeeding with the totality, the inclusiveness, and the wholeness that it has? Second, your panel seemed to have bridged the gap between civil society organizations and government leaders, being able to talk candidly about these issues and then come up with a report that it strikes me both parties are going to be happy with, at least at the outset. How is that achieved, and how do we make sure that that's likely to be achieved? What advice do you have for civil society organizations within this kind of institution of sustaining and accomplishing a convincing relationship with governments going forward beyond the members who are on the panel?
Microphone for Mirza Jahani. Mirza is with the Aga Khan Foundation of the USA, but also had a career at DFID in a past life as well.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you, John, for your comments. It's the point about practicality that made me put my hand up, because international documents like the ones that you have prepared and which talks about the long term and targets has a disconnect with practicalities about the development business and how we do it. We do projects with the USAID and DFIDs and the European Union for 3 years and 5 years. The business and of development is longer term. And we all believe that, but we never make that connection. Because if we are going to achieve some of these targets, you really have to have longer term partnerships, both with the communities that you're trying to serve, as well as the local governments that we work with.
Okay, we may just leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think, well, I'll just try to take them in order. I think with respect to people with disabilities, as we did our consultations and we tried to be quite inclusive in that exercise, not only to listen to representatives and organizational heads, but people with disabilities themselves. I guess I came away with a very strong view that the agenda needed to be one that was empowering, not that was aimed solely at providing a kind of set of social services. And I'd actually be welcome if you take the time to read the report and tell us whether we hit that mark. Because I think that was something that a number of my, I was bothering people. We gave the report to the Secretary General the Thursday after Memorial Day, and we were fighting about the last words. I was calling people back and forth on Memorial Day. So we were editing that report right up to the end. This was one of the points that, in fact, I kind of leaned in on towards the end. But so I think that what people want is the ability, much as I describe young people and other people who end up being marginalized, they want to be full participants in their societies, and they want the tools to be able to try to achieve that. That comes in part from basically providing the right sorts of connections and access, whether that's education or the other things I mentioned, particularly telecommunications, to give people the opportunity to participate. The UN itself, the UN system itself is focusing, I sometimes mangle the UN terms, but there's a special session of the UN General Assembly that's focused on the MDGs and to the question of what we can celebrate, that will both look back and look forward this September in New York. So a very major focus of this UN General Assembly with a good deal of head of government participation, I think including ours, is focused on this topic, to look back, to celebrate, if you will, what's been accomplished, but to not let your foot off the gas, not to go into a period for the next 2 years in which we're fighting about what comes next, without forgetting about how much more progress we still need to make on these 2 years. And I think actually a lot of people, both in the philanthropic community, national governments themselves, and in the development assistance community, have geared toward this end of the MDGs period for a lot of action. So I think we need to do that, and we need to celebrate. And I think that I don't know, I mean, again, I'm not sure I can answer the question of good advice about how civil society stays engaged. I guess that's what I do as a day job, which is, I think it just takes work, it takes a little bit of demand, it takes respect, it takes building partnership. And again, I come back to that expression. We spent like a whole day in Indonesia debating the difference between the word partnership and partnerships. Partnership being a bigger vision about the stakes, the accountability, the need for all segments of society to come together, as opposed to the specific partnerships, which have been really useful in things like food security and in the health sector and in education. But I think it's incumbent upon you to kind of organize for that. I already raised what was going on already in New York, but I think that the systems that have been put in place, the country consultations that the UN has done, the area and regional consultations that have taken place under this can't be forgotten. We need to keep that structure going as we move forward, and I think that everybody kind of lives in their own turf. But I think one of the things that happened over the course of the last year was that opened up a little bit. There was a lot of listening and learning, and I think the tools of modern communication actually make that easier. I did my first Twitter town hall. Now I'm addicted to Twitter town halls, and you learn a lot from that. And I think if the more that we can engage and be respectful and try to build that partnership, the better off we'll be. On the question of practicality, I mean, that's why we included this goal of creating the right kind of enabling environment, because you're absolutely right that many of the building blocks for sustained prosperity and poverty reduction really require a longer-term commitment, a decades-long commitment to change, energy systems, agriculture systems, the way we're delivering fresh water to people, building of infrastructure. Really is not a 1 year or 2 year or 3 year project. But I think what the global goal setting exercise can do is focus national goal setting where really the action is, and sometimes even at the local level, so that the focus on these specific interventions that really can make a big difference become the subjects that are debated by governments and civil society, where the table essentially is created, where national plans can be targeted, where resources and priorities can be set, and then with support from the international community, from national ODA, and from philanthropy, they can be implemented. So I think I very much subscribe to what you're pointing towards. But I think in the end of the day, that requires all of us to be thinking about that, to respect that time horizon, and to support decent national governance that will produce that kind of result.
Please join me in thanking John Podesta.
Thanks, Dan.
I'd like to ask Catherine Rafelson, Sid Washington's president, to come up, who's going to tell us what's going to happen next.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, John Podesta. I just want to quickly tell you the rest of the day's plan. We have a short break now until 10:30, and during this break you can get more coffee, and our exhibit hall will be open right across the hallway, so please go see what everyone there has to show you. Then at 10:30 promptly, our 4 breakout panels will begin, and they take place in the rooms that are right near the registration desks. So you all have a sticker, or some of you have a sticker on your name tag that indicates the panel you indicated a preference for when you registered. You're not committed to that. You can go to any panel you would like. But they are going to start promptly at 10:30, and then we will all reconvene in this room at noon for lunch, and all the rest of the sessions after that will take place here. So thank you all very much. Thank you again, John Podesta, and please go see the exhibits, and we'll see you back here at noon. Thank you.